Today, we're going to give an examination of the nuclear family irrespective of the way anybody else views it. Now, the current trend in the men's rights movement is that of a reflexive meme that follows a generalized path of fake conservative talking points with no critical thought or ability of its own. It would rather dismiss inquiry or conclusions that could possibly line up with what some feminists somewhere have proffered for their own separate agendas as being invalid or Marxian or leftist, etc., etc. Now it's time I inject the question of whether or not the traditional family is, as many have mentioned, the most stable arrangement for raising well-adjusted children, whether or not this stability is achieved by an unfair tendency towards male disposability, and whether or not women remain faithful to traditionalism when other more lucrative opportunities present themselves. The last question being the most important question that this video will seek to address. I will show with statistics and data, not with sloganeering about Marxism or defeating the left, but with hard data, that once sufficient mechanization occurs within a society, once sufficient affluence is developed, once women can sustain themselves without the need of the male dispensary that extends to them its labor, they will reject it almost immediately and from almost any alternative available. Now, traditionalists, social conservatives, and their ilk are known to rattle off sound bites about the efficacy of the nuclear family, but will not address its complete inability to resist the pressures of female economic independence and affluence. They will not address why across cultural boundaries, women choose to abandon ship in droves and with minimal encouragement once certain conditions are in place. Feminism, after all, never actually forced women to divorce in record number or to collect alimony monies they didn't earn. The question should be asked, and asked often, to what degree are women naturally inclined to the traditional nuclear family, and to what degree are they inclined to reject it once said conditions are in place? Now, first, I'm going to ask whether or not the nuclear family is at all the natural state for male-female relationships, as traditionalists say. I contend that it is not. The nuclear traditional family is a mechanism for the construction of civilizations which relies heavily on male disposability. My theory is a simple extension of Brifold's law scaled up to traditional relationships between men and women, and is as follows. Where the woman is in a traditional relationship, she will remain so under the following circumstances. A. There exists societal pressures that shame women for initiating divorce. And B, there exist limited or non-existent opportunities for women to acquire resources without having to trade sexual favors to her husband. The question that should be posed is, to what degree is the traditional Western family unit, or more specifically the women within them, are there based on financial motives? Now, if this traditional family unit isn't predicated on what, when stripped of its social decoration, amounts to no more than a long-term arrangement of prostitution, then we should not see any noticeable changes to its integrity when women are given the financial means to abandon it. There should exist stopgaps: romantic love, fidelity, loyalty, a woman's dedication to family and husband, all of the things that traditionalists cite as the glue that holds the nuclear family unit together. Which brings me to the cited Forbes article titled "Women Who Earn More Are More Likely to Divorce," which states, quote, and this is in the description box. It says, quote, "Career women who are family breadwinners are nearly 40% more likely to get a divorce than women without the same economic resources, according to a 25-year study," end quote. And further down, it continues by saying, quote, "Researchers found that the tipping point is when the wife pulled in at least 60% of the family's income. Couples in this position were 38% more likely in any given year to get divorced, and it didn't matter how rich or poor the pair were," end quote. So, gentlemen, what is this about? What is traditionalist marriage about to women really? It's about resources, and in this day and age, that means cold hard cash, to the point where it can be statistically predicted when women will begin to jump ship. Now, one can make the argument that these are not bona fide traditional women we're talking about, but the women in the West that have already been coached by 50 years of feminist influence. And in response to that, this is where we look to Asia for examples of highly traditional cultures where once economic independence became an option for women, they jumped ship in an even shorter amount of time than their American counterparts, 1 or 2 decades compared to 4 or 5 here in the West. We have China, who saw roughly 2 decades and a half of industrial revolution from about 1960 to 1985 during its period of readjustment, which set China on the path to economic competition with the West and modernity. The Chinese, from about 2000 onward, have been experiencing the type of growth and mechanization that has followed essentially without exception by increased affluence and economic opportunity for women. it comes as no surprise that the divorce rate has been steadily climbing and initiated by women in the majority. I cite one of several articles here, first of which is titled, "Women in China Embrace Divorce as Stigma Eases." Observe the following quotes. Divorce was once a dreaded fate for women in China. Now many younger urban women like Ms. Kai view it almost as a civil right, which has helped drive up divorce rates. One government study found that women had initiated 70% of divorce applications here in Guangdong province, where the number of divorce increased by 52% last year. It continues onward and says, to a degree, China's rising divorce rate is typical for a developing country that is rapidly modernizing and becoming more affluent. But the increase has been sharp since October 2003, when the government streamlined the process in response to citizens' complaints. It also dropped the onerous requirement that couples needed approval from their employers. A process that once felt like an inquisition can now take 10 minutes. Now pay attention to that last part specifically, in that we see this happen repeatedly in this transition. Some form of landmark legislation that doesn't specifically do anything to encourage divorce, other than to expedite the process for those that already wish to divorce in the first place. Now, it's important not to confuse this as government interference into traditional marriage. It's a catalyst for divorce. The fuel that drives the reaction has always been there. These types of legislations are universally followed by significant spikes in female-initiated divorce, regardless of which country and culture they're implemented. After this reform was put into place, divorce predictably jumped 21%, and China's divorce rate has also risen an average of 7.6% a year since that 2003 reform. And I quote further in the article, divorce is much more common in the more prosperous cities than in poorer rural areas, and in Beijing, for example, one study found that the divorce rate last year was 50%. Even so, divorce is also rising in rural migrant families where a husband working away from home may only see his wife once a year. End quote. Now, this is textbook, since in rural areas, women who are still largely dependent on male labor will not reject marriage in any significant way. They wait until it's economically safe to do so to reject it in mass. Now, moving on to India. An examination of India reveals essentially the same process. I quote the link article titled "The New Emancipation" via the Asian News Network website. The article says, quote, "The growing divorce rates in both countries," and referring to both India and China, which are old Asian civilizations with deeply held marital traditions, are consequences of their economic boom as well as their growing westernization and modernization, say the experts. In India, this means a growing number of women have become financially independent enough to leave abusive husbands. Where have we heard that before? There's been a decrease in the stigma attached to divorce, and there are greater opportunities for extramarital affairs in more mobile, urbanized, and interactive society, end quote. Again, financial independence for women leads them to divorce en masse. This isn't about love, gentlemen. Traditionalism will only work for as long as it benefits women. Once women have the option of garnering this benefit on their own, what follows is Brifelt's law down to a T. This is about cold, hard resources and whether or not men can provide it to women. Now, further down it says, quote, Ghosts, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but Ghosts, the matrimonial lawyer, began noticing the divorce rates climbing in 2000, about a decade after India began instituting reforms that strengthened its economy, mass media, and communications infrastructure. These are roughly the same factors that have contributed to the surge of divorces in Indonesia, another fast modernizing society and Southeast Asia's largest economy. The country of 240 million has seen a threefold increase in divorce rates since political reforms were instituted in 1998. This rate translates to 200,000 divorces a year out of 2 million divorce petitions, according to Indonesian news reports, end quote. So again, modernization, increased wealth, increased opportunity for women to gain financial independence is the main catalyst for rampant female-initiated divorce, even in societies that have an extensive, and in India's case, an ancient emphasis on traditional gender roles. They are unceremoniously discarded, no matter how ingrained, no matter how far back the customs of traditionalism extend. They will disintegrate in a decade or so the moment that women no longer need men for their sustenance, meaning two things. Women would not act in this way. They would not reject traditionalism so dramatically once the chance arose if they had any desire to be in or any general respect for the institution of traditional marriage. They do not become traditional wives for the naive vision of romantic love that traditionalist men are so prone to believe in. When they have the opportunity to subsist without, they do so blatantly and without hesitation, and at least in that aspect, I am happy for women. I'm happy that women don't have to live under this fake, unfulfilling marriage contract that they derive no satisfaction from. The true women haters are the ones that demand women submit to them, that women allow themselves to be led because it's their natural role, supposedly, when women clearly don't want any of it, collectively speaking, of course. Now, my only problem is when women use the state to financially extort men, when they use government to legally steal money and resources they didn't earn. My problem is not with women wanting nothing to do with a traditionalist bully that needs to exercise financial control over a woman to get her to pretend to want him. My problem is with the women that are so lazy that they're happy lying to men about the love and affection she has for them, knowing damn well that if she had a more convenient opportunity to support herself, she would never even associate with her husband. Both the wife and the husband in the traditionalist relationship are operating under a lie, a farce that requires both parties to willingly suspend reality. That's essentially what traditionalism is. Men that have otherwise no chance of having access to certain women offer what women do want from them, i.e. male labor, while pretending that the relationship or the marriage or family that ensues is not theirs solely because of the labor he is offering. Now, another interesting bit of data, and I want to say first and foremost that I cannot take credit for this find. I found this on fellow MRA's Red 0660's blog called Rebuking Feminism, and I also urge all of my subscribers to go and check it out for themselves. It's an excellent blog. But the data shows an interesting correlation between support for President Obama among both married and single women. The Gallup poll shows that the largest factor contributing to whether or not women support him was whether or not they were single or married. Divorced women and single women were more likely to support President Obama than married women, and to a degree that is larger and more statistically significant than those of political party lines. In fact, it was determined that although men were statistically more likely to be part of the Republican Party and women more likely to be Democrat, which really isn't surprising at all, the disparity between Republican female support and Republican male support for President Obama is negligible. And the difference between Democratic female support and Democratic male support for President Obama is also essentially negligible. Now we're going to compare the three graphs here. First, we have support for Obama between married, divorced, and single women. As you can see, there is a significant difference with single and divorced women giving significantly more support for Obama than married women. And now we see the graph of the Republican male and female support, where the graph is almost identical. And now we see the Democratic female and male support, where the graph is also almost identical. So to reiterate, the biggest determining factor of whether or not women support President Obama from both sides of the political spectrum is whether or not they have a husband. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to then raise the question of whether or not this correlation exists because married women have a provider to leech off of already, and single and divorced women are essentially married to the state, which supports my claim once again that traditional marriage, at least in terms of how women view them, is not about love, it is about money, resources, what you can provide them with, the lifestyle you can furnish for them. And knowing this, why would any man sign up for it? Or let me reiterate, why would any man with any self-respect, who isn't happy with an artificial, fake family that's dolled up in well-wishing fairy tale romantic euphemism to cover up the fact that it's a lie, why would any self-respecting man sign up for this? I mean, these men are happy being used by a woman that normally wouldn't give him the time of day. He's happy living a lie. He's Cypher asking Agent Smith to make sure he remembers nothing while he chews on his steak. His woman is a lie, his life is a lie, his family is a lie, the love he believes in is a lie. He knows deep down that love, the type he believes his wife has for him, is contingent on him paying bills, working some soul-crushing job for his mortgage, and to live out some shit existence of suburban purgatory. And that's the success story. That's the optimal arrangement. His inability to demand anything resembling an equal share of responsibility from his woman for his family is the real reason half the population does nothing but eat and make babies. It's utterly pathetic. And the funniest part is that he thinks his fake sham of a family is some accomplishment. He thinks knocking up some useless eater that he'll proudly support for the rest of his consequently shortened existence validates his fragile, female-validated masculinity. He's a boy proud to pay mommy's way so she can pat him on the head and tell him what a big man he is. He's a stifled adolescent arrested in his development, desperate to graduate to a manhood he has never independently conceptualized on his own. And as for his children, he's so obsessed with the prize of reproduction that he'll do so in an arrangement where he essentially will not have the spare time and energy to have any significant role in their lives. Traditionalists will not tell you the exorbitant costs of supporting children and the parasite wife. They won't tell you that you'll need a relatively high-paying job or income and that you'll be devoting 60-plus hours every week because, according to the wife, a good traditional woman's place is in the home. A euphemism for a life of leisure that too often culminates in the traditional provider being cuckolded since, well, it's his fault for not giving her the attention she needs while you were out busily providing. You know, when I was 13, I moved up to suburban upstate New York. Now, I'm not going to say where, but picture suburban Americana, where all of your neighbors are living this archetypical traditionalist middle-class existence, the kind that traditionalists refer to as the most stable for raising children. But I assure you, that stable it most certainly was not. If there's one thing I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, it's the modern traditional Western relationship, and I can attest from firsthand observation the amount of social dysfunction that goes on in these families. The women, all mothers, resent their husbands, blaming him for the dependency that she wanted from him in the first place. They're suffocated by the degrading role of being nothing more than a baby machine, and they're too much the moral cowards to honestly admit to themselves that a baby machine is exactly what they wanted to be in the first place. And so they silently bide their time, stroking their worker drone's ego when necessary while pursuing some dick on the side as often as possible with whatever men are around that weren't stupid enough to think that a soul-crushing 70-hour work week is an equitable price for one's genetic legacy. Now, as I've discussed before, these men, procreating in this traditional model, perpetuate themselves genetically, but never in any way that actually matters. They transmit no wisdom, no culture to their progeny. His children are shipped off to some public school system to be indoctrinated as young as the age of 5, and I've seen what the products of these sick, dysfunctional, traditional middle-class families churn out. A bunch of miserable, stifled souls, adolescent males that end up viewing their own fathers as exactly what they are, a disconnected, faraway bill payer, and a stranger whose motivations the son can only guess at. They'll never truly bond with their father. They can't. The daughter byproducts of this traditional farce are even worse off. So starved of attention from daddy that they spend most of their adolescence wanting to pay him back for a slight he never committed. Slutting it up to get back at daddy, and desperate for any male authority figure's attention. They're raised by reality TV and Facebook and Twitter because mommy's too busy enjoying her free ride and daddy's too busy at work for either of them to care about instilling values in their children. That's what reality TV is for. I mean, do you have any idea how dysfunctional these people, these fake, usually right-wing traditionalist, middle-class, pseudo-Ameri-Christian families are? Do you have any idea how fucked in their head their children are? I do. I've seen it firsthand, and it does not work. This leave it to beaver, nuclear family nonsense relies heavily on a set of conditions that simply don't exist anymore. Most notably the father, and to a lesser extent the mother, having almost complete control, almost indoctrinatory level control over their children's value systems, and in the age of the internet and mass communication, and most importantly, economic independence for women, this traditionalism nonsense doesn't stand a chance. And it will never make any significant return in Western civilization. It will never come back. Absent societal collapse, it will never return, no matter how much you ramble on about Marxism or leftism. Pandora's box isn't just open, the lid has been wrenched away with such force that it can never be closed again. And that's all I really gotta say about that traditionalism nonsense. Now, I want to talk briefly about lesbian relationships. Specifically the 1950s, which were host to a very peculiar time in terms of the lesbian community in the Northeast, particularly the Buffalo area of New York and parts of Canada, that saw a lesbian community on the cusp of and immediately preceding the first wave of 1960s American feminism, which adopted very, very strict gender roles. And we're talking about the butch femme dynamic that we often see in high-profile and high-status lesbian relationships. This was adopted almost universally by the lesbian community of that time period. They actively pursued relationships that mimic their perceived views of the traditional relationship, where butch lesbians were expected to act aggressively, initiating courtship, defending and even fighting for the feminine lesbians, and providing and protecting, etc., etc.
Femmes were expected to act like femme fatales, I guess. You never opened your car doors, or you didn't light your own cigarettes, and you never had to buy your own beer. You could go out with $1 in your pocket and go home with $1 in your pocket. Beer was only 10 cents a glass then, too, so you could go out and get drunk on $2.
I looked around and I thought, oh, cripes, I don't know what to do here. I don't feel like a real butch who could pick up a femme, and I'm no femme. No butch is ever going to pick me up. And so I sat there really isolated, and finally I kind of seemed to get a bit chummy with both sides, but never really involved with either side. And I went away from there thinking, after many attempts and going there, that maybe I had to make a stand and choose something so I could be part of this picture. And I thought maybe I'll become a butch, because according to those stories, the femmes did all the work. They went out and had jobs and cooked and cleaned, and butches just had to be cool and wear pants.
I would say there were at least probably a ratio of 10 to 1 butches to femmes. So it was really territorial. They would protect their territory, and heaven forbid that any other butch would cross that line. And it was like, well, like animals almost, like how lions defend their mates and that. It was that fierce.
I used to flirt a lot, and I got away with it a lot because, well, everybody thought it was cute, and it was, that's how you're expected to act. There's been a few butches have little fights, I guess,
Oh, there were fights all the time. There were fights all the time. It was most exciting. But then, you see, if you're leading a double life, what is the point of going to a nice friendly little tea party when you're not doing your teaching or whatever else you do in your daily life? Why not go to somebody, really lead a double life? That place meant you led a double life, indeed.
Now, I find it amazing that during a time immediately preceding feminism, where lesbians were essentially left to their own devices and tolerated to a degree in their own isolated social scene, that they then took it upon themselves to rigorously adhere to traditional gender roles, to the point that femme lesbians that sought out relationships with other femme lesbians were marginalized and subject to the pejorative term kiki, in the same way that many lesbian and gay relationships are marginalized by heterosexuals. So I bring this up to pose the question: why, during the first time in American history that lesbians were tolerated and given free rein to pursue their own same-sex relationship roles within their own social scene and culture, did they immediately set out to adhere to the traditional model and shame others that resisted this? Now, I believe, and this is admittedly conjecture on my part, I believe that it's because the relationship in the female mind defaults to the sex for safety and resource barter system. They naturally assume that they will be trading sexual favors for provision. And who is doing the protecting and providing matters not, even if it's another female, even if it's government. Politicians extend courtship to women. Women dispense votes, which are the politicians' metaphorical sexual desire. In return, politicians give them protection and provision. The lesbian butch does exactly the same. Now, the point I'm making here is that we have a period predating feminism, meaning lesbianism had its own identity at the time, such that it was devoid of 1960s feminist influence, and it chose to essentially artificially recreate traditional gender distinctions that allowed one pseudo-gender, the femmes, to depend on another pseudo-gender, the butches, for protection and provision, and this was done within the underground culture of 1950s Northeast lesbian nightlife, where no pressing societal conformity was expected of them. Now, this interesting little bit of history implies to me that traditional gender roles in the view of the traditional woman, of the femme lesbian, or the heterosexual infantilized female wife is viewed always through a cold bottom line of what I can get for dispensing sex. She is essentially a prostitute in search of the highest paying John. Now, post-feminism lesbian relationship roles after the 1950s discarded the butch femme model for a more androgynous model with an emphasis on the feminine, citing the butch lesbian, as a form of patriarchal mimicry. And so when we examine a Swedish survey, the first of its kind, where statistics on same-sex civil unions in Sweden were compiled from when they were legalized in 1995 all the way up to 2002, The survey revealed a high rate of legal divorce among homosexual couples, where gay male couples were 50% more likely to divorce within an 8-year period than were heterosexuals. Yet the part I find most interesting was that lesbian couples were an astronomical 167% more likely to divorce than heterosexual couples. So if we take men completely out of the equation, where we have these androgynous lesbian relationships influenced by feminism, where traditional mimicry and butch provider protectors are shunned as patriarchal mimicry, and since these are still women after all, we see a 167% rise in the incidence of divorce as opposed to a 50% rise in male same-sex relationships. And I suspect the reasoning behind this is, of course, female sexual entitlement. Both parties in the relationship dispense sex with a cost attached to it. Now, we've often seen lesbianism framed in the context of female sexuality being more fluid than that of men, but if anything, it's constant. It's more constant in that women are much more likely to view sex with their significant others as a transactional exchange, where each partner, being female, expects her main contribution to the relationship to consist of rendering sexual gratification. Now remember that in all patriarchies, societies, even one that is in its pre-collapse feminist intermediary, we see expectations from society in terms of what women offer other than sex converge to zero. Now, if both parties in a relationship happen to be female, a competition then ensues where both parties want utility in return for sex dispensation, and they then begin to resent each other for each other's sexual parasitism. Much like the traditional heterosexual wife begins to resent her newly unemployed husband when all of a sudden the onus is on her to provide for the family, even if he's willing to do all of the household chores that traditionalists identify as being just as valuable and just as important to the raising of a traditional family. And yet, since no societal mechanisms are in place designed to shame women into providing and protecting for other female significant others, this may explain why many lesbian relationships indeed took on that butch-femme dynamic where one female adopts the traditionally masculine role of provider and the other dons the submissive feminine role. Now, what we have to ask ourselves, really, is whether or not women truly do view this relationship, this traditional relationship, as nothing more than a cold financial transaction where they are provided for in exchange for male labor, and whether or not this exchange is even. I leave that decision to be made by you. The fact is clear that within these relationships, men live less. If this was an equal exchange, as I've said before, we would see essentially men living as long as women. We would see the same longevity, the same lifespan, unless men are somehow biologically prone to living less than women, which I don't believe to be the case. We would see an equal transaction here. And we need to start examining these relationships, these traditional relationships, in terms of what women are contributing exactly other than sex and reproduction. To me, it's a fake, it's a farce, it's a lie. And I will continue to debunk this nonsense for as long as it's being injected into the men's movement. So I've said a mouthful, and that's all I really got to say for now. More on this later, though.